Okay, thanks very much, Paul. I have to say that Paul was my inspirational teacher and tutor when I did my master's course here. So it's very nice to be introduced by Paul. But it gives me great pleasure to be here today because it's 43 years since I first set foot in this school to do a DTM&H, as Paul mentioned. So I feel as if I've come back to a place I started in. And in this lecture, I'm going to reflect on my long career in epidemiology, but focusing on two diseases that have marked my life, cholera and conzo. It gives me particular pleasure to be giving this lecture for the John Snow Society, which commemorates John Snow's life, work, and also, in a way, it commemorates cholera. And why? Because cholera has not only marked my life professionally, it's also had a profound personal impact. Because my great-great-great-grandfather, James Linnet, died of cholera in the slums of Lambeth in the 1848-49 epidemic, which was when John Snow first formulated his hypothesis about the importance of water as a mode of communication of cholera. 7 years later, James' son William emigrated to a new life in Australia with his 20-year-old wife and two young boys. Both boys perished on the journey. But the couple, as you can see, prospered in Australia. They had 9 more children, and here I am, his descendant, returning to London 157 years later to give this lecture. Now, I know that the lecture's titled the Pumphandle Lecture, and that we're going to the John Snow pub after. But I'd just like to remind you that there's another cholera memorial in London, a plaque over in Lambeth that was put up in 2010 to commemorate the epidemics there. And I'd like to suggest that as a teetotaler, John Snow might even prefer being remembered by this plaque. But I'm not going to oblige us to hike over there after. In preparation for this lecture, I immersed myself in the writings about cholera in Victorian England. I was struck by the detailed descriptions and the sheer quality of writing of John Snow and his contemporaries. But I was also struck by the parallel between events of that period and cholera in contemporary Mozambique. But first, I'd like to look at my ancestor's death. And we can look at it in some detail because by then the death certificates were being collected and registered. So this is his death certificate. And I am going to go through it in some detail, but if you look carefully, you can see that he died of cholera. And much of John Snow's work was based on William Farr's compilations of data from these certificates. So they were the basis of Snow's work. So how do the details of this particular death relate to the descriptions of John Snow and his contemporaries of the 1848-49 epidemic? In the small area of Lambeth Church 2nd Subdistrict, where we know James Linnet died, 544 people perished from cholera in that epidemic, and another 90 from diarrhea, which I think may well have been cholera. The death rate for cholera alone was 24 per 1,000 in this sub-district. Farr remarks that this was a district which cholera visited with great severity. As an epidemiologist, I'm going to use time, place, and person as a framework to look in more detail at the certificate, a framework which was used so elegantly by John Snow to argue for his hypothesis that cholera was waterborne. James Linnet died on the 23rd of July, 1849. This was at the height of an exceptionally warm and dry summer, just like this one. Snow noted that each time, when cholera has been introduced into England in the autumn, it's reached its climax at the latter part of the following summer and declined somewhat rapidly as the cool days of autumn set in. The 1848-49 epidemic in London exactly followed this pattern. In Lambeth Church too, the epidemic rapidly increased in the summer of 1849, and in July, the month that James Linnet died, there were 123 deaths. By September, there were 236. Now, Snow gave several explanations for this seasonality, but one of them I rather liked, that there was an English propensity not to drink much unboiled water except in warm weather. And since I arrived here, the members of the John Snow Society have been plying me with cups of tea. And I've been saying, no, I just want water. It's too hot for tea. So I think that's just a small observation. In hot summers like this, people drink a lot of water. Now, James Linnet died at 46 Wickham Street, and I've marked it with an arrow on the famous John Snow map of the water supply in 1854. And I think most people here know this famous map, but the green area was supplied by the Southwark and Vauxhall Company, and the pink by the Lambeth Company. The dark area in the middle, where James Linnet lived, is where both companies overlapped. Both drew their water from a contaminated part of the Thames. When Snow analysed the cholera deaths by place in 1849, because he did before his famous later analysis, he noted that in every district in which the supply of the Southwark and Vauxhall and Lambeth extends, the cholera was more fatal than in any other district whatever. Although the Southwark and Vauxhall and the Lambeth companies professed to filter the water, they supplied it in a most impure condition. So James Linnet was drinking heavily contaminated water. In 1852, Lambeth Water Company moved its source of supply upstream to an uncontaminated source. So then Snow had his chance to do an even more famous comparison, and he in fact did many comparisons. When I actually read the book, I saw that. And one of them was a comparison of cholera deaths in 1849 and 1854 by sub-districts. So I could pull out the data on Lambeth Church too, and in 1849 there'd been 554 deaths from cholera. In 1854, with many houses in the sub-district now receiving clean water from the Lambeth Water Company, the number of deaths fell to 193. So if he'd lived, James Linnet would have had more chance in 1854. In Wickham Street, 22 people died of cholera in 1849, 3 at number 8, and the streets graphically described by William Farr. This street is in a very bad condition. No drainage, badly ventilated and crowded. In winter, the roadway is impassable to foot passengers. There being accumulated a quantity of mud and stagnant water, quite green. The inhabitants are obliged to form a gutter to prevent the surplus water running into the lower rooms of their houses, which are below the crown of the road. This was the London in which my ancestors lived. James Linnett was an adult male of 53 years of age, and from far we even know the age and sex distribution of the deaths in Lambeth Church too. And in that sub-district, the greatest number of deaths occurred in adult females, not in adult males, and this fitted a broader pattern. At the beginning of the epidemic in 1848, more males were in fact affected. But at the close of July, the females died in greater number than the males and continued to do so till the end. Now, Farr was noting things and analysing them, but it was John Snow who often provided a more convincing explanation. And he explained this by saying that early in the epidemic, men were out and about, they were travelling, so they were exposed to cholera. But as it advanced, women were more affected as they attended the sick. Now, James Linnett was a bricklayer, one of 27 bricklayers and stonemasons to perish in Lambeth Church too. Now, as I went through this data, I really did find that Snow analysed everything. So he analysed the occupation of those who died from cholera in that epidemic, and he showed that those such as sailors who lived or employed on or close to the Thames had the highest death rates. Footmen and medical men who presumably had access to better water supplies had much lower rates. And bricklayers were somewhere in the middle. James Linnett was a widower who died at home with a female neighbour in attendance. I think we need to remember that there was neither medical care nor a hospital available in Lambeth for most cholera victims, so most died at home. The duration of his attack, we know from the death certificate, was 14 hours. Cholera killed swiftly, but he died more quickly than most. And I even found an analysis by Farr of almost 40,000 certificates. Now imagine doing that by hand. And the average duration of illness in males was 49 hours. Now, I'm not quite sure the significance of this, but it was certainly done and it's there in the data. So I managed to find an awful lot out from the writings of Farr and cholera about my ancestors' death and that particular period in London. But now I'd like to move on to talk about some aspects of cholera in Mozambique. For the last 40 years, Mozambique has been severely affected by cholera. Since 1997, we've had an epidemic somewhere in the country, often in many places, every single year. So cholera is established in Mozambique now. In 1981, soon after I returned to Mozambique from my Masters in Community Health in Developing Countries, I faced the difficult task of trying to control a cholera epidemic in Maputo Central Hospital, which was the teaching hospital, Mozambique's capital. I thought the task would be simple, but in fact it took months. It was extremely difficult to control this particular epidemic. This is just a slide of the cholera ward. You can see it's overcrowded. Mother and child are on the floor. There are people in beds either side. You can see the mother's eating a bread roll, and the child has a bottle. So even though the ward looks rather clean, there's plenty of opportunities for cholera to spread there. But, this felt like a fairly mundane epidemic, and we knew that there were other outbreaks in institutions in Mozambique It didn't seem, it was hard to control, it was bad that it was happening, but it kind of seemed rather normal. But we're encouraged to publish it by Richard Feacham. I'd just come from the school. Somehow I talked to Richard that this was what I was now doing after I'd gone back from my master's degree. And Richard Feacham said, you must publish it. So we published it in the Transactions as an example of how cholera could be spread from person to person. Of course, the transmission's still fecal or oral, but the transmission is person to person, not through water. Richard Feacham also encouraged our Tanzanian colleagues to publish because they were also struggling with epidemics in Muhimbili Hospital, the teaching hospital of Dar es Salaam. We, in fact, had 2 epidemics, but they'd had 3. And they published in The Lancet in 1984 on their 3 different hospital outbreaks. Now, John Snow's remembered for the Broad Street pump, and ever since, people have looked to the water supply as the source of cholera. And I decided to look it up in preparation for my lecture to see what the current wisdom on person-to-person transmission is. So I did what everybody does, punched it into Google, and I found WHO fact sheet, cholera is spread by contaminated water and food. Sudden large outbreaks are usually caused by a contaminated water supply. Only rarely is cholera transmitted by direct person-to-person contact. Then, there's a more recent CDC fact sheet on the Haiti cholera outbreak. Frequently asked questions, and admittedly this is specific for Haiti, but it's a general question. Can cholera be spread from person to person? Person-to-person transmission is extremely rare, even to health workers during epidemics. Now, in both Mozambique and Tanzania, we also reported that health workers in the wards had developed cholera. There weren't many, but there were some. So this is what, in some ways, the current wisdom is, that it's extremely rare. But when I went back to Snow, the source, I found that Richard Feacham was absolutely right, because Richard had said to me then, when he encouraged us to publish, you know, Snow also placed a lot of emphasis on person-to-person transmission. And in fact, the first section of the mode of communication of cholera is titled Cases Proving Person-to-Person Transmission. And Snow gave a long catalogue of cases where he believed person-to-person transmission had happened, and said it would be easy to quote as many cases similar to the above as would fill a large volume. Also remember that Snow had explained the adult female preponderance as the epidemic advanced by their care of the sick, not by the water supply. So Snow was thinking about both modes of transmission, and he found plenty of cases of person-to-person transmission, but they're not so easy to locate in today's literature. And I admit that our epidemic and the Tanzanian epidemics are now 30 years ago. So I wonder, has hygiene improved, or is perhaps person-to-person transmission underpublished or undernoted? And if there are people here with ideas on this, I'd very much welcome questions and comments. Now, there's another parallel between cholera in Mozambique and cholera in England and Europe in the 19th century. Cholera riots. And I'm going to use the word cholera riots, although there's a book published recently that says we shouldn't use the term, we should use contentious disturbances. But I think cholera riots is actually a better expression. Since 1998, a large area of northern Mozambique has been subject to violent cholera riots. And when I say they're violent, they are. Health posts have been destroyed and closed. There have been injuries. There have even been some deaths. And as a response, there have been detentions. And this is quite a major topic in Mozambique. Why are these riots happening? The fact that they're still continuing, that they happen almost every year. The latest were in January and February of this year. Sorry. And this is just a headline from Radio Mozambique Online to illustrate. If you look on the internet, there's lots and lots of news reports on the Mozambican cholera riots, but they've never made it into the medical literature. And this is just the headline: Disinformation about cholera in Cabo Delgado, which is a province of Mozambique. Violence erupts in Murabue, 15th of February 2013. And the latest riots were in January and February of this year. And we have a seasonality in cholera. So it then went down, and now it'll be coming up again with the hot weather. Now, the riots in England and Europe mostly occurred in the 1820s and 1830s, and they've been extensively documented. I mean, there's books, there's analyses, there's articles, and they show that the population rioted against the rich and powerful, and there were numerous reports of aggression against doctors. In Paris, Hungary and Russia, doctors were accused of poisoning the poor. And in Hungary, they were even forced to drink chlorine. Now, before this lecture, I learned a fact that I hadn't picked up and that I may stand corrected on, because Ros said that John Snow actually got interested in cholera because he was a toxicologist, and people thought that maybe there was a poison involved. And so if she'd like to elaborate on that later, or if, once again, there's a lot of people here who are experts on Jon Snow, so please tell me if you know more about this aspect. But in England, by 1848-49, the social ferment had died down. People knew cholera better. But in 1832, when cholera had appeared for the first time, there was widespread public fear. And as I say, there were also widespread riots in this country. But even as late as 1854, when John Snow was doing the Broad Street work, the Medical Council reported that people were concealing illness and deaths from cholera, and that there was great difficulty experienced in several houses in Broad Street in obtaining the requisite information. And I also found plenty on the bad relations between the hated sanitary inspectors and the people whose houses were inspected. And Dickens even wrote about this. So there was ill feeling then, mistrust probably, but there weren't riots. Now, in the Mozambican cholera riots, a consistent feature is a belief that the government is poisoning water. Due to the emphasis on cholera as a waterborne disease, chlorination of water is one of the mainstays of the health services response to cholera in Mozambique. The need for better hygiene is also taught, so there is recognition that there can be spread person to person. But better hygiene is just a message, and it requires water to be available in sufficient quantity. Whereas the active, visible presence of the health authorities in prevention is in disinfecting water. So wells are chlorinated, both public and house wells, and chlorine's distributed for use in the home, and both health services and NGOs do this distribution. And this slide shows a leaflet on a product called Certeza, which is diluted sodium hypochlorite, which is widely promoted and distributed to disinfect water supplies. Now, this active chlorination program has been received with mistrust in the cholera riot areas. One reason is that in Portuguese, the words chlorine and cholera are similar. Now, I'm going to try and say them with my English influenced Mozambican accent, and if there's a Portuguese speaker in the audience, they can probably do it better. But it's chloro and cholera. Now, they sound very similar. So people also blame that on some of the confusion, that they sound the same. You're going around putting cholera in the water. Now, the riots in Mozambique have produced a small gem of a study by a Mozambican sociologist called Cholera and Catharsis. And I'm mentioning this study because I actually think it's quite brilliant, because he took 20 students from Eduardo Mondlane University, and they went and interviewed communities, health workers, NGOs, and they produced a very good piece of work. Now, in this study, the people interviewed asked some difficult questions, which showed their distrust of both the health authorities and NGOs. If health workers usually ask for money for treatment, why should they now be giving chlorine for free? If an NGO normally helps only selective groups, why should they suddenly start helping the poorest affected by cholera? And how do these people from the cities know that cholera is coming? And I find this particularly difficult because our prevention is based on advance warning. But if we warn in advance, people think that we're bringing it. So it's very, very difficult to resolve this particular question. So looking across almost 2 centuries of cholera riots, several common features stand out. The riots all occurred in times of rapid social change. The rioters were from poor communities affected by cholera, and they attacked symbols of government, and more specifically health workers and institutions. There are no easy prescriptions to stop cholera riots when they're caused by an underlying inequality, as they were back then and they are now. They show the need to tackle this inequality, to increase coverage of health services, so the poorest communities are not just served in time of cholera, and to improve communication, for which we need the help of the social scientists as epidemiologists. Now I'd like to talk about the other disease that's marked my life and career, and that's called Konzo. In 1981, I was sitting in the epidemiology department of the Ministry of Health, not long back from the London school, when a telex came in. polio outbreak. Member district, 38 cases. Sorry, I've put Portuguese here. Reflexes increased. It was from the Provincial Health Directorate of Nampula. And you can see that there's a problem, because in polio, the reflexes disappear, they don't increase. So our interest was roused, but we actually thought, oh, this is probably just a mistake. So I set out with a team for the area, and I was greatly relieved to meet two incredibly competent Swedish doctors who were already there and who'd begun the investigation. One was Anders Molin, and the other was Hans Rosling, who gave this lecture 2 years ago. So we were very lucky. They were there and they'd begun the investigation. The situation was dramatic, because there were already hundreds of people paralysed and the numbers were increasing. This is just a scene from one of the mission hospitals where there were dozens of children and adults, all with a spastic paralysis. This was a mission hospital in Kavar, which was one of the worst affected areas. And it was a disease that we'd never seen or heard of before. So it was a huge challenge. It was indeed a spastic paraparesis. Here you can see the characteristic gait, and there were increased reflexes, so that first message had been absolutely right. The area was in the grip of a severe drought, the worst drought in living memory, and there was a major food shortage. But over 2 months, we struggled to understand the causes of the epidemic. And I was fresh from my master's studies at the school, trained in the tradition of John Snow by Paul Fine. And so we put the principles of epidemic investigation into place, using time, place, and person as our framework, just as John Snow had done. And we should have taken more notice of the elderly man who told us at the beginning, this disease has happened because the rain has not washed our cassava. And I've got that written in my notebook, to my embarrassment, because we searched fruitlessly for an infectious agent. Nothing. And finally, we decided to ask for thiocyanate levels in the blood samples we'd sent off, because we'd remembered what that old man had told us. But also, it was beginning to become obvious that this might be cassava. So they came back, and the mean serum thiocyanate concentration in 248 patients was 329 micromole per litre, which is about 20 times the normal value. We also did a small case control study, and the concentrations were also very high in the controls. But we still thought the cause seemed clear. Mass cyanide poisoning, and the culprit, bitter cassava. Now, cassava is a staple food for over 40% of the population of sub-Saharan Africa. Here's a slide of the cassava plant. This is not in a drought, a normal, healthy cassava plant. And this is what it looks like normally when there's no drought. But during the epidemic, people were dependent on a diet of bitter cassava, as all their other crops had failed. Bitter cassava's high in cyanogenic glucosides, which break down to give you cyanide. And the concentration of those glucosides increase in drought. Now, bitter cassava needs to be processed before consumption. And this area, the main processing method was, and still is, sun drying. But this method, you can see cassava cut up, laid out to dry in the sun. Now this method's inefficient, breaking down the cyanogenic glucosides, and it takes time. And in 1981, people didn't have that time because they were starving. So they were eating the cassava without drying it. Now, this bitter cassava hypothesis, which we developed, John Snow developed his water hypothesis, and as I said, we also tried to fit it into the distribution in time, place, and person. Distribution in time, the peak was in August, which coincides exactly with the cassava harvest. And with time, it died down, but with time, the cassava dries, so the levels fall. So this distribution in time fitted the hypothesis very neatly. We also did a map of the distribution, and maybe I need to just point here. You can see the coast is spared, and also the towns are spared. And on the coast, people weren't as dependent on just bitter cassava because they had fish to eat as well. And in the towns, they also had a more varied diet. So the place also fitted in with the bitter cassava hypothesis. And most of the affected patients, in fact, this is from a later epidemic, but they were mostly women of reproductive age and children over 2. And this could be explained by their poorer nutritional status, and probably women don't eat such well-prepared cassava. You know, men tend to get their meal that the women have prepared. But also, of course, breastfeeding children are protected, so we don't see cases in children under 2. By the end of the epidemic, well, over 1,000 cases had been reported, with an incidence rate as high as 34 per 1,000. And we subsequently found that the same disease had been described before. We'd never heard of it. Nobody had heard of it. Nobody remembered. But back in 1938, an Italian doctor in the then Belgian Congo had described an absolutely identical disease, and he'd called it Konzo. So we decided to go for the same name. And the disease has actually continued in that area ever since. But, you know, it's a remote area, it just kind of dropped off the map. But Konzo is now reported in lots of other places in the DRC. Total of 6 countries in Africa have Konzo epidemics and sporadic cases. So the problem is ongoing. But in Mozambique, we haven't had a large-ish epidemic since the last drought, which was in 2005. So 2 years ago, I went on a journey back to the site of our original investigation with Hans Rosling. It was the 30th anniversary trip. So we discussed the possible scenarios. Now, you may have gathered that both Hans and I are a bit obsessed by this disease. And so we went back and we thought, well, there are 3 scenarios. Problem's gone away, we can rest. There was an imminent danger of a new epidemic, we'd have to act urgently. But the truth was somewhere in the middle. We found exactly the same conditions of 30 years ago in Kava. Communities living in extreme poverty, dependent on a diet of bitter cassava, reporting symptoms of acute cyanide poisoning, and the occasional case of Konzo. So we looked at each other and we said, oh, we can't rest just yet because Konzo epidemics could easily happen again here in the next drought or if there's another type of agricultural crisis. Last year, my colleagues went back to Kavar and they took urinary thiocyanate samples from 50 healthy school children. The mean concentration was 530 micromoles per litre, which is also around 20 times normal and about what we'd found in the epidemic. So that also shows that we can't rest. Then on top of that, this year, Wavin and colleagues in the DRC showed impaired neurocognitive function in children in Konzo-affected areas compared with a control area. The children with Konzo were most impaired, but other children in the Konzo-affected area also had impaired cognitive development. So this is a worrying new finding. So we can't rest. The danger of Konzo epidemics is still present, and the continued cyanide intoxication may be causing neurocognitive damage. As an aftermath of the Konzo epidemics in Mozambique, we also have hundreds of paralysed people, many of whom need lifelong rehabilitation. And as if to remind me of this, as I was coming to give my lecture, the day before I left, I received a phone call, my first ever, from one of the Konzo victims, living in a remote village. By a small miracle, my colleagues in Nampula had managed to get a cell phone and solar charger to him. So he rang me. He rang a lot of other people, but I think he thought that I might actually be able to help. So this young man is actually inspirational because he'd completed secondary education in the district capital against all the odds. And now he's teaching literacy back in his village. But he's trying to get into teachers' college. And I was kind of left thinking, how on earth can I help? It's beyond my powers to get people into teachers' college. But it was like a kind of warning message. Don't forget the victims. And I think that's something I've learnt working on Konzo along the years. Both the people with Konzo and my colleagues have taught me never to do research without taking the patient's needs into account. Needless to say, we have tried to do rehab for the patients, and we've had kind of sporadic projects. We've never managed to keep it up for a long time, but we have managed these sporadic projects. We're trying for another one, but it's all been rather unsatisfactory. It's just very difficult to provide rehabilitation in these rural areas. But just as an aside, I'm on our polio eradication expert committee, and I worry about the cases we're detecting in our polio surveillance because we're not able to provide rehab for them either. And I think we do need to look more closely at how we can provide rehabilitation to cases we detect. Back to Konzo. How can we prevent it? John Snow had the pump and the Pumphandle. And in public health, we're always looking for the simple solution. For cholera, John Snow could remove the Pumphandle and had the brains to work out that's what needed to be done. Now we've got adding chlorine to water as a simple solution. And for Konzo, we've also now got an attractive, simple solution. Because an Australian scientist has developed a wetting method to remove cyanide from cassava flour and other products. This shows a poster explaining the method. It's very simple. You just wet the flour, leave it in the sun for 2 hours or the shade for 5 hours, and the cyanide evaporates. Brilliant. And the method has actually undergone trials in the DRC, which are successful, although they wouldn't fulfill the criterion of a proper randomized controlled trial. In the DRC, Congo's still frequent. But we're trying to implement this now in Mozambique. But we're not sure if communities will accept it. Not by chance, the Konzo and Cholera Riot areas overlap. And the solution requires women to change their food preparation habits and take an extra step. Never easy. As a skeptical Italian who studied at this school said to me, could you convince an Italian housewife to change the way she prepares spaghetti? And I think it's difficult to change food preparation habits. And will communities in Mozambique embrace the preventive message if we don't have much Konzo now? And we're not having droughts at the moment. So it's difficult. But, you know, I've worked for so long on this disease. I want a simple solution as well. So it's very attractive. But can we promote this simple solution also without attacking the underlying poverty and inequality? I believe in simple preventive solutions. I want them. I think they can be enormously effective, and I've spent my working life promoting them. They're the bread and butter of epidemiologists. But I recognize that they may only be part of the solution. And looking back again to my ancestors, what did they do faced by extreme poverty and disease? They emigrated. They left. Now, unfortunately, today it might not be so easy for them to get into Australia as economic immigrants, but back then they were able to. And in Africa, people do the same thing. They move. They move internally from the rural areas to the overcrowded slums in cities. Of course, they might well get cholera there, just as people coming to Lambeth did in London all those years ago. But I think the prevention of Konzo is difficult. It requires a sustained effort in rural Africa to combat the poverty, hunger, and inequality, which are its root cause, just as preventing cholera requires improved sanitation and water supplies. Thank you.